Hi everyone and welcome back to the course. This lesson is our first exercise where we'll create a scene or a still life rather. We'll create a table, some fruit and a bottle. In making these three objects, we'll see different ways of modelling. And I think it's something quite good to start off with. It's a simple scene, but it will show you different ways of working. Okay, so this is our interface. As you can see, I have it in a different language. I have it in Spanish. I showed you how to change the language in the previous lesson, but I'll repeat that now. So here in Preferences, we'll change it to English. And we get this window, as I explained to you earlier. So we can click on OK or Accept. And remember that we need to exit the program and open it up again. Okay, so we have the program open and it's all in English. The language has changed. Okay, so let's get started. To make the table, we're going to start with the primitive shapes. So go here to this icon and we'll select the cube. This cube will be the base for our table. So this is quite simple. If you drag this orange point here, then you can scale it like this. And if you drag the axes, the X, Y, or Z, then you can adjust the shape to get the table. Something like this. Okay, now for the legs. You see here that the shape can be divided into segments. So if you put a 2 in here on the X axis, then go to Display, Gouraud Shading, you see how it's divided into 2 segments. If you increase the segments here, then see what happens. So you could put 15 in here. This is for the Y axis, the one that goes down here. So let's leave that at 1. And we could put another 15 here. Okay, something like this. Now from this angle, if we make the object editable, pressing this here, and the polygon selection, we could select these ones using Shift to add to the selection, and this would be for the legs. This is one way of doing it. So now what we do is right-click and extrude, and then we lower the legs just like this. Like I said, this is one way of doing it, but in 3D there are different ways of doing it. So let's go back and I'll show you another way. We could make the cuts ourselves. Obviously, in any 3D object, the fewer polygons it has, the more optimized it will be. The number of polygons we use depends on what the model will be used for, whether it be an animation, video game, illustration. Then the number of polygons is something you need to consider. But as this is just an exercise, it doesn't really matter. So let's get back to the other way of making the table. So we'll make the object editable. And now go to Layout, and we'll change it to Modeling. And see how at the bottom these icons have appeared, which are different to the standard layout. And these are various tools we can use on our model. So we'll select this one to cut the model, the knife, and we get this panel when we select that tool. Depending on the mode we set, so let's select Loop, we can make the cuts from wherever we want. So let's make a cut here, for example, and another one here. Bear in mind that Cinema is not a 3D program like AutoCAD or SolidWorks, where everything, needs to be very precise. Here we can work freely. We could or we should do it by measuring. But for this exercise, then it's fine like this. So we'll make another cut here. We'll do another one around here. So you saw that we made the cuts more or less from wherever we wanted. There is another way of doing this. We could select the plane mode. And then we have to choose the coordinates here. Okay, this one is fine. And then you can put the number of cuts. So we'll put 2. And notice how now we get 2 lines. So if you increase the spacing, then you increase the space between the cuts. I could put 130. Let's choose the top view to see it better. Okay, let's make it bigger. Okay, I think we've gone over a little bit. Okay, I think we're getting closer. I think here is fine, more or less. So we'll make the cut. Now, if we change the plane, we can do it the other way. So increase this. Okay, more or less here. So we've made the cuts in 3 different ways. Now, we have these polygons here in the corner. Let's select them. Select this one while holding down Shift. Select the rest. And now we'll extrude again, but this time on the inside. So right-click, Extrude Inner. And as you see, we can extrude, but inwards. And now right-click again and extrude. Okay, to about here. Don't worry, the table doesn't have to be perfect. This is just an exercise to learn how to use the basic tools. So we have the table. Maybe we could give the leg here a bit of a finish. So we could try out bevel, something like that. Okay, something like that. We could also work on the middle part. We could use bevel again. We can also edit this bevel. So if we go here to subdivisions and we put 2, see how when I apply the bevel, it divides into 2 cuts. But we have enough with 1, so we'll change it back to 0. Okay, I think here is fine. So we have our table, and we've learnt the first way of modeling in this program. So now we're going to make a bottle. Again, there are a few different ways we could make a bottle, but one of the easiest ways to use is the splines. The splines are here, as we saw in the first lesson. Okay, let's go to front view. And here we'll hide the table. Okay, so you see the axis. Well, this is going to be easy, so we're going to select Bezier. By the way, you might see this on your program a little bit differently, but don't worry, you might have a different version of the program. So Whether you have 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, it doesn't really matter. Everything you'll see on this course is included in all of those versions, so you shouldn't have a problem. So back to splines, Bezier, as I said. Now, what we're going to do is make 1/2 of the bottle. So how do we do that? You can just observe a real bottle, and you can copy the shape. So we could make a point here, another one here, and just keep going on like this. Okay, now we need to make the curve. This works a bit like the pen in Illustrator. Okay, so I've done 1/2 of the bottle. You can modify this too. So if you go here to rectangle selection, you can select the points that you want. We could raise them like this. We could also lower these like this, making a different shaped bottle. Okay, now the interesting part is this icon here. So select Lathe NURBS. Okay, nothing has happened yet, but if we place the spline inside this, well, then we get the shape of the bottle. And there we can see the bottle. If I go back to the point where we were before, or even going back to where the spline is inside this, if we select here, so we can see the points, then we can adjust this at any moment. So this is a non-destructive way of modeling, as the initial properties of our object are saved. Okay, so we can adjust it however we like. We can duplicate this with Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V. We can move one of them to the side, and we could work on one like that. Then you can carry on experimenting with different shapes. You see that this area here is open. You can leave it open if you want to. But if you want to adjust it, it depends on how far this vertex, this point, is from the center. So if I move it away from the y-axis, the green one, then you see that the hole closes. So we could leave it like this. Or if we are completely satisfied with how our bottle looks, you can copy it, Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, and I can make it an editable object. And now, as it's an editable object, we can select whatever we want. And we can use different tools, like, for example, extrude, as we did earlier. When we made this an editable object, notice how the color changed from yellow to blue. That's because when we do these operations, the polygons rotate. So the yellow side is actually on the inside. See here. And the blue part is now on the outside, but it should be on the inside. We could leave it like this, but for some operations it might give us problems. So it is a good idea to turn these polygons around. To do this, just go to Select, select all, to select all the polygons, then right-click, reverse normals, and there we go. So we have the table, we've made some bottles, although we still need to scale them, so we'll do that now. Okay, so now we're starting to get still life scene. So we could continue with the table. We had left it as it was, pretty simple, as it was the first thing that we started with. But now we'll carry on and we're going to make an apple. And when we do this, I'll show you some more of the point selection and how to move those points. So to begin with, let's make a sphere. Okay, here you have the properties for the sphere, and in type, you see there are different options. So I could select icosahedron, and now the polygons that make it up have 3 vertices. So depending on what type of object we're making, we could use one option or another. For the apple, we'll just use a standard sphere. We can also increase the number of segments. Let's put them up to 35. And we'll make it an editable object. Let's click here so we can select the points. There's an option in the polygon selection, which is this right here. Only select visible elements. With this deactivated, we'll be able to select points that we can't directly see. So right now, I don't have it selected. So if I select, let's say, these points here, then what happens is the ones behind are also selected. So if it's activated, they don't get selected. But now if I deactivate it, you see that all the points that go around get selected. So you just need to be careful because I've also selected these points here by accident. Another option is to go here to select. And, well, first we need to select the apple, then select loop selection. With this, we get a circular selection or a loop. Now let's select this point, and having this unselected, just make sure that we haven't selected any other points. And what we'll do is push this down like this. Okay? Now we'll make a loop selection. By the way, if you press the space bar, you can jump from one tool to another of the last ones that you've used. So we'll make a loop selection and we'll move this around here. We'll select these ones too, and we'll move them a little bit. We can also add some cuts here. in loops, for example. We can make one here, another one here. So depending on how we want this apple, we'll go selecting the points and moving. Okay, this part is the stem of the apple. What's going to be the stem. So we can make a cut here, select the polygons, and extrude. Okay, raise it like this. And now we'll make some cuts like we did before. Remember, if you make a mistake, it's not a big deal, don't worry. You can just go back and correct whatever you need to. Okay, so loop selection. And we'll make a cut here, another one here. We can do one down here, more or less. Select the points. And we'll scale as we did before. So loop selection again. And finally, a cut here. So as you see, the more cuts I make on the stem, then the more detailed or precise it could look. We could also adjust the area on the bottom of the apple, where there would be a small dent. So again, loop selection, and we can adjust this a bit like we did on the top. Okay, something like this. Okay, we're going to scale this apple. Let's rotate it a little bit like this. So the idea of this lesson is that you learn the basic tools of the program. So this first exercise is very, very basic, but we're learning different ways to model. There are many, but right now we're learning the main ones. We saw how to use primitives, model using primitives, like we did for the table. We extruded the leg, used the knife to make cuts. We moved those extrusions that we made of the different parts of the models. We created splines. We generated shapes, in this case using the NURBS. So this first exercise, as I said, is meant to be simple. Okay, we could just rotate the apple like this. Okay, let's duplicate it to make another one. Okay, we can place it around here. Okay, remember, if the table is a bit small, we can just make it bigger. So our first exercise is pretty much completed. So let's do a quick recap of what we've done so far. So to make the table, we started off with a cube, to which we made some cuts with the knife. Remember that when we make a cube, before we make it editable, we have the option to divide it into segments. And to see this, we need to go to Display and select this here, which was the Gouraud shading lines. The other option is to make it editable, change the layout to modeling, and make cuts with the knife. Make sure that polygon selection is activated, and you can make however many cuts as you like. We saw that there are different options or modes of cutting. You can just play around with this to practice. So you have line. This cut is quite free. So as I said, it's just a case of trying out the different options to see what each one does. So you've got one to make holes, you have plane, loop, as we saw earlier. Loop is probably the one that you'll use the most, but you might also use plane quite often. Okay, to make the bottles, that was quite easy. We went to front view, and with a Bezier brush, we need to make a shape that's 1/2 of the bottle, or the glass, or whatever it might be. It's important that the points reach this middle here. Oh, one moment, I'll just do this again so you can see it clearly. So starting from here, we'll make the shape of the bottle. Okay, so something like this, just something quick to get the basic shape. Then we'll apply this nib. We'll place the spline inside it, and then we get the other side of the bottle. Okay, and there is our bottle. And finally, we saw another very simple model, which was our apple. For this, we used another primitive. We used a sphere. We first made it an editable object so that we could start to model it. Okay, now what we're going to do is get an image of the scene we've created. It's going to be something quite simple. First, we'll add the first light to the scene. To do that, we'll go to the light bulb icon. And as you see, there are different options, different kinds of light. The first one, light, is the one you'll use the most. It's the most simple. It's called Omni. When you apply it by default, it appears in the center of the grid. And then you just need to move it around to find the point where you want the light to come from. Like here, for instance. And now we'll activate the shadows. So in this case, we'll go for shadow maps. And there you have the shadows on the objects. Let's click here to take a look at our image. And this is our first image. Okay, it's not amazing, but it's a simple task that's pretty effective. You can also change the color of the light like this to get different effects. In details, visibility and shadows, you have various options, but this is still a bit too extensive to explain in detail at the moment. Right now we can just apply this type of light and see how we get the effect of the shadows. In the light panel, there are other interesting lights like the spotlight. So if we remove the light that we had before and apply this one, you see it creates a spotlight that we can focus on a specific area. I think this would look great. It could be even better for our image than the light we applied before. Okay, we need to activate the shadow. So shadow maps again. In details, you have different options that you can try out. You can adjust the inner and outer angles. And this changes the light diffusion. There's also the contrast. So let's apply a warmer color to this light, like this yellow tone, for example. We're also going to add a floor. To do that, go to this icon here. Here you can find other elements like sky or background and then floor. Okay, so there's our floor. Obviously, we need to place it properly. Also, this appears as a square, but just so you know, it's actually infinite. So let's select all the elements we have except for the floor, and we're going to raise them a little. Okay, just a second, I'll just go back. Okay, we'll take it up to the height of the floor, something like that. And we'll increase the size of this light. We can do that with these points here, as if it were a primitive shape. We can also add different lights. We can put back the one we removed earlier. We could leave it with no shadows. We could give it a blue color instead. So we can just play around with different lights, which is how you would do it in a professional image anyway. In an illumination kit, you'd have overhead lights, you'd have side lights. But the advantage we have here is that we can deactivate the shadows quite easily. Okay, now to generate the image, we have to go here to Render Settings. And here in Output, we can adjust the properties we want our image to have. So for example, the size. We could put 1000 by 1000. It's digital, so 72 pixels per inch. Let's go to Save. And here we can choose where to save our image. So I'll just save it to the desktop. So I'm just explaining the main functions of these elements here. In anti-aliasing, we could change this to best, and this improves the curves, makes everything sharper. And for an introduction, there isn't much more that interests us here at the moment. So for this first image, we have enough. If we click here on this render icon, then we get this image that we can see here, and the image has now been saved. It's here on the desktop, as you see. So we now have our first 3D image finished. If you're not happy with that view, then it's just a case of changing the angle. You could also change the angle of the table. We could put one of the bottles in a different place, maybe fallen. So this still life is all about experimenting with different elements, trying out the tools, different shapes. So instead of an apple, you could make a banana, for example. And how could you make a banana? Well, that's very simple. So let's create a cube. I'll just do this very quickly. It's just to show you how simple it is. So scale the cube more or less like this. Now, while we're here, I thought I'd explain a bit about the hypernerbs. I was going to leave it until the next lesson, but I think it's quite important and it's something basic, so I think I can explain it now. Okay, to make this editable, before let's divide it into segments. Okay, something like this. Okay, make it editable, and we'll select the points we want to be able to scale it. For instance, these ones here, we'll select them and scale them. And the same for the ones at the bottom, select them and scale them. We'll scale the points in the middle. We can move them like this. Okay, now you might think, well, this is too square. It doesn't really look like a banana. Well, now I'll show you one of the most common tools in this program, which is used to soften the edges. And in this program, it's known as hypernerbs. And you can find it right here. So I'll click here. And right now, it's not visible. But if I place the cube inside of it, then see what happens. All the edges and lines have been softened. Okay, just a moment. I'll hide all these elements here as they're getting in the way. Okay, so there's our banana. As you saw, starting from a very basic shape, we get this softened version, which actually looks something more like a banana. And this is something that you can do with the hypernerbs. But it all depends on how you model your shape. So if I put a segment here, and another one here, when I apply the NURB, see how it's not so perfect anymore. So if I add more segments, then it's harder to soften the edges and the shape becomes less organic. So if I add a segment here, see what happens. So in this case, we want there to be less segments to keep that banana type shape that we had. So we can now make this an editable object. But actually, before we do that, here you have the subdivision editor, which is at 2, and the renderer, which is at 3. That means that if I click here, I'll see a subdivision of 3 and not 2. But in the editor, it will be a subdivision of 3. So if I change this one to 2, this to 1, then I have the edited object, but with less subdivisions. I don't really need that many. Okay, we could select these polygons here on the top and extrude. And we start to see the shape of the top of the banana. I'll make a cut around here. Well, before I do the cut, actually, I'll just place this properly. And now I can make the cuts. So, one here. I am going quite quickly, but I just want you to get an idea of how to make the main shape of the banana. Obviously, usually you would go slower and take more care with each of the elements. Let's make one more cut around here, and we could leave it at that. You don't really need to do any more. So I wanted this lesson to be a first introduction to the software, where you could practice using the basic tools and functions. So we've got a banana, we need to scale it. To do that, let's make everything visible again. Okay, we can place it. Still a bit big. Okay, let's duplicate the banana to put one in a different place. And with this, our first exercise is done. Okay, we just need to choose the view we want to show in our image. And now we'll render. And we've got our image, it's saved here on the desktop. There it is. And that's all for now. In the next lesson, we'll carry on with some modeling, but we'll start to do some things that are a little more complex, and I'll also show you how to add a background. Okay, so I'll see you in the next lesson.